what we have in the chat. So we had first the questions from Marie-Hélène Wiesekop, who is questioning whether we start from this assumption that all what exists today in law is already ethical, and would some of you, so I think we answered a bit the question by making well, in the setting, but could you who would like to take the floor to answer this question?
Can I give it a try?
Yes.
Yes. I think that's a very important question, because ethics is something that we fundamentally disagree about. So it would be an illusion to think that we can somehow come to an end agreement about that. I think that would also be a very bad idea. The difference with law is that for some things that we as a democracy believe should be ordered in a certain way, that we need certain norms that everybody has to abide by, is that we decide about which part of that ethical, what sort of compromise is possible. And this is about coordination of interaction between humans, between institutions, between technical systems. But I don't think the idea of the law is that it should impose a sort of general ethics that we all agree on. The thing of law is that we must accept that we're not going to agree on a lot of things, and that we nevertheless then manage at the political level. Once again, this is about power, about who gets to decide what. Certain norms are issued. So it's very important, I think, not to expect the law to agree with my particular ethics. And I'm also very curious what the person who asked the question thinks, but I don't know whether there's space for that.
Well, yes, Marie-Hélène, as we are a bit putting things in parallel, I think she has the time. Marie-Hélène, would you like to come in? You can unmute yourself.
I think you've addressed the point. I think I'm sitting here with my colleague, and we were just putting it into perspective that we shouldn't make assumptions come with the questioning that we have, and that was our question around that.
Okay, thank you, Marie-Hélène.
Thank you.
So, and then the next question was from Vidas, and in fact, Laurence touched a bit upon that. So Vidas is asking, taking the point that in fact lawmaking is a process as well. It's not a single activity. I rephrase a bit, and oops, sorry, are there some kind of tests? So Vidas would like to know. Then the law is maintained. So I'm sorry, are there some kind of tests when it should fail and when it should not fail, then law is maintained? I don't get your question, so please come in. Vidas? I understand that you would like to test to have tests to show whether the lawmaking process is ethical or not. So like I don't know, what do you mean?
You know, in software development in IT infrastructure, usually we use kind of testing approach. But there's a testing approach. It means when we develop something and we maintain it, after some changes, we apply some kind of tests, and these tests usually have kind of should test the behavior of your program, and in some cases it could fail and it should not fail, so that we prove that everything is fine again. And in lawmaking, I also see kind of, if we maintain this, can we what changes we make, and how these changes in the law make this current law the same as it was, and it doesn't broke anything. It doesn't make impact to other laws, regulations. So it's kind of this is my question. Can we have some kind of tests that evaluates impact of changes?
So your question assumes, so as I understand it, it would be that we are in a code as law, and where law is data, and that you would test, you would be able to apply some automated testing to make sure that law is consistent, so the proposed law is consistent with the rest, and that the person would be guided, so the law drafter or the one who prepares the law would be guided to improve aspects thanks to this automated testing.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, okay, so interesting. And I think that Mireille would, I don't know, what do you think, Mireille, because you were quite strong about saying that law should remain as text, but maybe we can take this a bit later. So either you have or another, because Mireille, you already, or who would like to answer, to have a point on this? Perhaps
I'd like to say something, if possible.
Yes.
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it highlights the complexity of the different approaches that exist here. So I made reference to better rules, which is the approach used in New Zealand, and it's a formalization method for creating a computable, let's say, representation of a text-based law, which you can then apply tests to, as you described, like unit testing, which I guess is what you mean, Vidas. But the purpose of that is solely to check whether the norms that you've written result in logical impossibilities. And when I say logical, there's a vast area of literature on the concept of logic in legislation, but I really mean legislation like tax legislation, where we're talking about numbers, very precise thresholds, which in a sense can't really be interpreted. Even that's a controversial thing to say, but the point of better rules and the point of that kind of intermediate point on the spectrum of automation is purely so that the text that comes out at the end of the process is logically sound, so that when it gets interpreted by a court and by businesses and by individuals, they're still doing all of the standard things that one does with a textual law. It's just that the text that they're reading is of a better quality because it doesn't have these logical lacunae. Now, the problem is that seems to me to be a perfectly legitimate use of computation, because what you're trying to do is to provide a piece of textual law at the end which makes sense and doesn't have these holes which nobody would want anyway. So you're detecting the holes, you're fixing the holes, but that's not the same thing as then automating the execution of that law. And the distinction is utterly crucial. And I think one thing that we need to be very careful about is using tools, using technology, using computation to make better law, but not using it to perform law. And the difference is huge. I mean, we use Microsoft Word to write law. No one would suggest we go back to typewriters. So we can use these tools to make things better, but we need to be very clear about where the boundary lies so that we don't undermine the nature of law.
Very clear. Maybe we go now to your answers, and then, but I saw that there are a lot of questions or a lot of discussions in the chat. But first, let's look at your answers about which direction you think we should go in addressing digital ready lawmaking. Alors, bring up concrete examples like the one on self-driving cars and discuss them. Okay, so you would like to be more to give flesh to the discussion with.
May I add 1 minute there, something, because I think that's a very interesting remark, because this is also the point is that when, for example, from liability, we have the notions of when is a product defective and when it's fault, but what we indeed need is really tangible examples, because one day judges will also be confronted with questions of allocating liability, for example, and they will need to know when exactly an AI system is defective, which criteria do we use. So this is a very, I think this is a very good point that's brought up there.
Thank you. Next is human first approach, AI and human cooperation. So I don't know who wrote this and would like to elaborate a bit more. Okay, no answer. Promote good practice cases. Okay. And if I can read, go to the practice, go for the practice. Okay, so this goes to the idea of having more concrete example. And then next one, more flexible, easily adaptable, and balanced cultural ethics. Text and enforcement. Impact assessments can be equally important. And I have issues in, okay, I cannot see. Nyovi, I have the recorder, so I cannot read the whole.
Yes, so an EU AI supervision authority mechanism could help since humans are not fully aware of AI capabilities.
Okay. Thank you. So I think that timekeeper, where are we with the time? Because we have now well, we have more questions. I think we still have some minutes for the questions.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes for the questions.
Okay, so it will be difficult because it's a huge list of things. Alors Mireille, you added some comments about harmonized codes. And yes, it was, I think, during the discussion when Jelle was explaining the need of companies to have disambiguated laws and easy to check.
Yes, maybe maybe it's good to distinguish two things. So I think if you would actually replace text-driven law with code-driven law, companies would not be very happy with that, because in the first instance you say, oh, now everything is clear and simple, so I just have to comply with that. But then you find out that because circumstances are changing all the time, the system will not adapt to that, because you cannot, when you write the code, foresee everything, if only because then it would again become very complex. That's not what you want. So then companies would stumble against a certain rigidity that does not take into account what we usually in the law call reasonable expectations, unacceptable consequences. So the law has a lot of inbuilt adaptiveness that is in the nature of natural language. So when people begin to tell me that law is always lagging behind, I'm sort of becoming very exhausting. No, law has to pick the right level of abstraction, and that's very difficult. That's also why it takes a long time. Not to fall into the trap of being over-inclusive, not to fall into the trap of being under-inclusive. But that right level of abstraction will allow the law to adapt to different circumstances. And there are so that doesn't mean that the court can just sit down and subjectively make all sorts of decisions. Court is constrained in what it can and what it cannot decide. Now, another matter is whether there are specific parts of laws, and let's take the GDPR, where you could somehow try to automate either the side of enforcement, which is more in this realm, so write laws in a way that self-execute, or automate on the side of the provider, for instance, of personal data processing systems. So that would mean automating compliance. And I think there is definitely scope for that, maybe on both sides, though automating enforcement under the rule of law means that you need to be able to appeal to that, and that appeal gives you what the court in Strasbourg calls effective and practical protection, not something on paper. So you cannot say, okay, we're automating enforcement, but your appeal grounds are restricted to just 3 very limited grounds. That means we're outside the realm of the rule of law. So that's why harmonizing code, so the comparison was made with directives that harmonized legislation, required that the member states basically do their own thing as long as it serves the goal of the directive. And the point was, couldn't we do the same thing with harmonized standards for law, for the application? And I think that in specific sectors, so when you have a big piece of legislation, high level of abstraction, both the GDPR and the AI, proposed AI regulation make a lot of space for that. So code of conducts, etc. That there, it would be extremely interesting to sit down and to see how you can make things simpler, reduce complexity, while still keeping your eye on the ball. What is it that we want to achieve here? And I think it would be very important to involve companies and sectors and citizens, of course.
Of course.
Maybe can I quickly react? Because
course.
I just threw it out there, and indeed, conceptually, I think, yeah, if we look towards standards which are currently being used, in a way, they are also more close to code often than to regulation. The way they are written, they include formulas for calculation, so they're not far off. But yeah, thinking on that as well, I think my point was not we should code all law. Indeed, law has to remain flexible and adaptive in a way, but it could really be help. For example, if we look towards, again, the AI regulation, stuff like data governance or the technical resilience, I really see there some possibility to have some harmonized code to help companies understand what basically is meant by the text translated into some form of code, which they can then use to make their own adaptation to ensure that they comply with the requirements set out in the law.
Okay, and at the EU level, indeed, as you know, there are these first level legislation that usually should keep this really text-driven approach where there is room for adaptation, and then you go into the implementing acts where it goes more to the point of semantic aspects and what is really required. And if I may draw a bit of a balance between your both approaches, it would be at that level that we could push more for code-driven in the level of the implementing acts that and by the way, we are trying to move in that direction to provide some code-driven legislation, or at least that are not code-driven yet, but they have a reflection. They have a if you take the finance reporting, regulatory reporting, some regulatory reporting processes in the finance sector, they have been standards designed and they are used by systems, and they apply directly. They embody digitally the law requirements. I found, I don't know if you want to react on this, but else there was another input from the audience. And Yovi, please, can you also, because it's again the recording, I can just see that there was something more.
Cecile, do you mean in the chat section about the questions?
No, it was in the the input for which direction we would think we should take.
Yes, there was the last one, which is about the regulation and lawmaking.
Yes, so I can see that, but then
Yes.
it's not visible.
So the question is, and it was also added to the chat, the regulation and lawmaking, yes, but how to make it ethical and not to stop or block innovation. It is different ecosystem on how to make AI ethical, and that was also something that we discussed. Like that was also one of the questions that we had in the slides.
Okay. So we still have, so there was a reaction then from Laurence on the agility or the no agility of laws.
How rigid they are.
Yes, and but that was, I think, a comment. And Isa, I would think about harmonized code not as a mean to fill the ambiguous parts of the legal framework, but translating the rigid parts of law into a minimum requirements like reference standards. So it's a bit the point I made with in the implementing acts when you have some where you have more rigid semantic definitions that you could or requirements like regulatory reporting requirements that you could expose as code. Then I wonder who makes a choice about what rigid and what isn't. Yes. And whether there is a risk of a function creep. Could you elaborate more about what you mean by function creep and this comment, Laurence?
Yes, it's kind of a metaphor. It doesn't really normally apply in the legal context, but I'm just wondering about the kind of reflexive effect here. If the definition or the threshold between what's rigid, what's deemed to be rigid, and what's not, could over time be pushed further and further, because we come to realize, oh yeah, it's quite nice having these codified, computational norms. Why don't we just keep going and make more and more things become rigid when previously they would not have been? And that's a slippery slope, right? Because we end up with things that previously were reasonable, interpretable, etc., becoming codified. And the temptation to do that might come from various quarters. But because the framework is there to do it, it becomes extremely easy just to do it, and maybe we forget the consequences of that. But there's another thing I wanted to say about that, which just came to mind. The idea of the rule in some sense being self-standing. I don't think that's correct. When we implement a norm in law, we're implementing a whole bunch of stuff behind it too. The rule isn't just like one line of text inside a regulation or an act or something. It in a sense brings with it everything that it's built upon. So the whole of contract law or the whole of tort or delict or whatever. And so I think if you think about holistic compliance, and compliance seems to be the sort of ethos that we're taking here, you're not complying with one rule, you're complying with all of the rules that build upon what makes that rule, what gives that rule the shape that it has, the meaning that it has. And if you're going to computationally represent just the rule and assume that if you meet just that one rule that you've met everything that lies behind it, that's problematic in terms of, particularly in terms of process, but also in terms of the meanings that the rule would have if it was textual and if it was then interpreted by a court.
Well, thank you. So there are a lot of more questions in the chat.
Can we jump on one question from Patricia Bachmeier on how could we include the citizens' input when they don't have the technical knowledge or don't have the context information? That was something that we also touched upon, and maybe we can elaborate a little bit more. So I don't know if anyone wants to answer to this.
Jan, maybe?
Yes, this is indeed a good question. And with the Knowledge Center, which also constitutes Smith from the VUB, so it's all connected to each other, they're working on a lot of initiatives that really include citizens to go around with the DG bus, for example, to really work on data literacy initiatives. With the Knowledge Center, we also have sheets that we spread. We make information very accessible. But the challenge is indeed that I think there's so much information. I mean, you can go to events or information sessions on technology and law, or digitalization and law, AI and law, on a daily basis, let's say. So the information is there. It's just about finding like ways to disseminate it in society. And I think there it's, for example, surprising that political parties do not really seem to focus so much. Okay, they all say the citizens has to be involved in digitalization, but the law and technology is not as such a big issue upon which political parties can make a difference. And I think there, if the moment it starts becoming something, as is, for example, climate change, then the moment it's getting much attention at a more political level, then it becoming tangible for citizens. Then they can be aware of the dangers. So I think there, this is the way that we could go.